I've been asked to speak on is ironic because Whitman himself said, and I'm reading from the preface to the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, which was the first, and I'm going to get back to that point in a minute, but Whitman begins Leaves of Grass in the preface. As we all know, Leaves of Grass began with a prose preface, which never appeared in any of the other 6 editions of Leaves of Grass, for reasons which we don't have to discuss here. So it was a one-time shot, and it's much neglected, which is unfortunate because in addition to its inherent beauty, a lot of what Whitman was really about, at least in 1855, is there. But he says, and then, so the title of today's event is Toward a Poetry of the Demos, Reimagining America. Well, here's what Whitman says. The Americans of all nations at any time upon the earth have probably the fullest poetical nature. America's already poetic. It has a poetic nature. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. So I could just sit down. Well, he didn't have to imagine or reimagine a poetry of the demos. The demos is the poetry. In fact, he goes on to say later in the same preface, he says, I can't read you the whole things, but he says, all other states indicate themselves in their deputies, but the genius of the United States is not the best or most in its executives or legislatures, not in its ambassadors or authors or colleges or churches or parlors, but always most in the common people. They are unrhymed poetry. So I'm done. The United States is itself a poem, and the common people of the United States are unrhymed poetry. What's left to say? Well, what's left to say is to understand how Whitman could say that and what he really meant by that. And to do that, which is what I'm really going to try to do, we really have to refocus our attention in a drastic way. Because first of all, we've got to take ourselves back from the crises and concerns of today, 175 years to 1855, when Whitman self-published this totally unknown, totally uneducated nobody, published this incredible cycle of poetry and one preface, Leaves of Grass. And secondly, and this is going to be even harder, especially after the delights that we've all enjoyed up to this point, we're going to have to understand what Whitman meant when he talked about the United States being a poem and the common people, the demos, being unrhymed poetry. We unfortunately have to move from the realm of art and poetry and all those wonderful things we've been talking about to metaphysics. We've got to go to metaphysics because, as John Dewey, let's see if I can find that quote. Oh, it's in mine. You will not find this for sale here, my dissertation. But I had to go there to find this quote. So, the American philosopher, great American 20th century philosopher, in an essay he wrote in 1911 says, Maeterlinck's philosophy of life, Emerson, and Walt Whitman are thus perhaps the only men who have been habitually and, as it were, intuitively aware that democracy is not a form of government or a social expediency, but a metaphysics of the relation of man and his experience of nature. So, to understand the Whitman of 1855 and understand how he could say those things about our poetical nature, he's really making a metaphysical claim, and I'm going to have to talk about that metaphysical claim in order to really respond to the subject of today's event. I want to say one more thing in introduction before I get going, which is this. Whitman is everywhere. I mean, he's everywhere. It's hard to pick up a piece of newspaper and not read a quotation from Whitman. But Whitman, as he himself said, is large. He wrote the first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855. It had 12 poems. He died in 1891. At that point, there were about 400 poems in Leaves of Grass. And as he himself said, when he said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." And he does contain multitudes. But the Whitman I'm interested in, because I think it's the Whitman that is really the purest and most radical Whitman, is not the Whitman of 1871 when he wrote Democratic Vistas, which we heard a lot of. It's the Whitman of 1855 when he wrote this incredible poem called Song of Myself. And I'm going to try to convince you as I go through this that Walt Whitman, contrary to, you have that very avuncular picture of Whitman, you know, in the thing, right? You know, he's got that beard, he's very uncle-like. Well, Whitman was a wild, crazy radical in 1855. He's probably one of the most radical writers who has ever written in the United States of America. We've kind of been lulled into thinking of him as the good, great poet. You know, after the Civil War, when he attended to the wounded and all that, he suddenly became this very comfortable, comfy person, but he wasn't. He was a terrible radical. And so I'm going to begin by saying that I want to focus my talk on one passage. I'm going to read a couple more, but one very underappreciated and undervalued passage, which I think in this one passage, I'll argue, contains everything that Whitman really thought and believed and intended about democracy, the concept of democracy, the metaphysical concept of democracy when he wrote his original work. So this is from, he called his stanzas chants. So this is from Chant 38. And this is really the heart of what I have to talk about today. So he says, "The grave of rock multiplies what has been confided to it, or to any graves. The corpses rise, the gashes heal, the fastenings roll away. I troop forth replenished with supreme power, one of an average, unending procession." I troop forth with supreme power, one of an unending procession. So to unpack, there's a lot to unpack in that one passage, and I want to begin with the metaphysical claim. Remember, what was he evoking here when he talks about the sepulcher, the graves, giving up its grave and trooping forth? The resurrection. He's talking about Jesus. Okay? He's Jesus. He's claiming to be Jesus in 1855. And not only is he Jesus, but every American common person is Jesus. Think about that. This is right in the wake of the second great religious awakening of the early 19th century. Religion was serious stuff, and he's claiming to be Jesus, okay? Well, what did he mean by that? What's the roots of that? What's the metaphysical root of that? And I'm going to take you to what I think, for me, was the most eye-opening thing I ever read by Whitman, and the thing that most explains Whitman, and certainly the early radical Whitman. And this is not a line from Leaves of Grass. This is a line from his private notebooks. And about Whitman originally contemplated becoming an orator like Emerson. Okay, he thought he would become a public speaker. And slowly he came to the idea that he could better express himself poetically. Thank goodness he did that. But as he was going through this, he kept these private journals that were not meant for publication. Fortunately, they have been maintained and curated. And in these notebooks, in some ways, you see his deepest you see the development of his thinking. And listen to this. This is something he says in about 1848. Remember, okay? Where is the being of which I am the inferior? I have never yet known how it felt to think I stood in the presence of my superior. This is in italics in the original. If the presence of God were made immediately visible before me, I could not abase myself. How do I know but I myself? And then he doesn't continue the sentence. In the presence of God himself. I mean, agree, there is a God. There he is. I can't abase myself because I've never felt that I was in the presence of my superior. That is a radical statement. It'd be radical today. And that is the essence of the metaphysical Whitman. It is exactly as Dewey said, it's a claim about his relationship to the universe and all of our relationships to the universe, that every single human being is without superior. Well, you don't have to take my word for it because I'm going to read you the next quotation I want to read. This is from a lecture that he wrote and never delivered because he became a poet, but here's what he says. Why has it been taught that there is only one supreme? I say there are and must be myriads of supremes. The whole scene shifts. The relative positions change. Man comes forth inherent, superb, the soul, the judge. The common average man advances to place. God disappears. God disappears. The whole idea of God, as hitherto presented in the religions of the world for thousands of years, or rather scores of thousands of years, disappears. God abdicates. So Whitman's conception of democracy is rooted in that view of the inherent supremacy, the absolute value, moral, ethical value of each and every person, not merely because they're a creature of God who's abdicated, but just inherently, by nature. Human beings are individually the source of value in this world. And the demos, that troop of people that he's leading out from the grave, every one of us is supreme. So when you ask, what is his view of, what was Whitman's original view in 1855 of what it meant to be a democracy? It is a state in which every single human being inherently, just by nature, for no other reason, is absolutely supreme in and of herself. Okay. Now, just one more thing I read just because I enjoy it, but it's just to sort of put a cap on that idea of how extreme and radical, because people don't understand this about Whitman, how radical this guy was. In 1855, he says, this is an excerpt from a long passage where he talks about all of the great figures of prior religions, including Jesus, by the way. He's not afraid to go there. He says, magnifying and applying come I, outbidding at the start the old cautious hucksters. Jesus, among others, is a huckster. Okay. This is Whitman, Leaves of Grass, right? The most they offer for mankind and eternity is less than a spurt of my own seminal wet. Any of you ever hear that line? Any of you ever think of Walt Whitman claiming that Jesus Christ wasn't worth a squirt of his sperm? This is the Whitman, the real Whitman of 1855, and the real essence of his metaphysical view. I mean, what are the implications for this today? I mean, well, we're caught in And I think, excuse me, the one really important issue that I think frames the problem this poses for us is that Whitman was pre-Marx. Whitman was a socialist. His father subscribed to the socialist newspapers. But what was lacking in the world at that point, Das Kapital was published, 1870 something, I think, is that the individual could still be seen by Whitman as an individual and valued strictly as an individual, not as part of a class. The demos, as conceived by Whitman back then, was not a proletariat. We got to get that clear. It was not a proletariat. Every individual stood by himself or herself. All right, so that raises the question, I think, which is very germane for this meeting, which is, well then, what's the value of a poet? If the United States is inherently poetic, if every common person is not only supreme, but poetically unrhymed poetry, who needs a poet, right? Well, here's where, Whitman maybe contradicts himself a little bit. But I'm going to read you, it's a little long, but I think it's really important to cap what I'm saying here. This is also from this underread preface. He says, he's talking about the poet, and he says, let me see where to begin this to cut it up. Okay. Of all mankind, the poet, I'm having a little reading trouble, so forgive me. Of all mankind, the poet is the equitable man. We'll talk about what he means by that in a minute. Nothing out of its place is good, and nothing in its place is bad. He bestows on every object or quality its fit proportion, neither more nor less. He is the arbiter of the divorce, and he is the key. He is the equalizer of age and land. Obedience does not master him, he masters it. Okay. High up out of reach, he stands turning a concentrated light. He turns the pivot with his finger. His brain is the ultimate brain. He is no arguer, he is judgment. He judges, now this is the key line, and this is the essential line. He judges not as a judge judges, but as the sun falling on a helpless thing. As he sees the farthest, he has the most faith. His thoughts are the hymns of the praise of things. And now skipping a little bit. The presence of the great poet conquers, not parleying or struggling or any prepared attempts. Now he has passed that way, see after him. Second key line. There is not left any vestige of despair or misanthropy or cunning or exclusiveness or the ignominy of a native, of nativity, or color, or delusion of hell, or the necessity of hell, and no man henceforth shall be degraded for ignorance, or weakness, or sin. So, that's more or less brings me to the conclusion. So, we, as I said, we're in a hard place because we have to place ourselves back before the Civil War, before all of our modern notions of civil rights and social justice. And we also have to put on our metaphysical and philosopher's hat, not our artist's hat. For Whitman, the common person in the United States were poetry. And the reason they were what was so poetic about the common person was that every common person is a supreme, absolutely valuable, without any question. And to the extent that the United States could recognize that value in every single human being, the United States was a true democracy. A little hard to get from there to here.
Okay. Questions? I mean, I have one question I could ask. I mean, it seems to me that the greatest political crisis of the time in which Whitman was writing, he wanted to rise above it and not argue aside.
You mean the Civil War and slavery?
Isn't that the case? That he didn't want to argue?
No, I don't think it's the case at all.
I mean,
Whitman, as he said himself so famously, was contradictory, or at least appeared to be. Whitman valued the Union. I mean, Whitman, first of all, I mean, this question of Whitman and slavery, Whitman and color, that those issues are tremendously important and really, really much discussed, but that wasn't my subject. Whitman worshipped the Union. And yes, he opposed the Civil War. Although once it was fought, he became a great admirer of Lincoln. As you know, one of his greatest poems being his, eulogy for Lincoln, where the lilacs lasted till your hearts blue. But he's complicated, and he did in fact oppose the war because he, as I said, he believed in the Union and wanted to maintain the Union. Yes.
What baffles me about Whitman is that he was accepted.
Not originally.
That this radical,
But he wasn't. He was fired. He had a government job. He was fired from his job. We think of him as the figure of the late 19th century, but no. I mean, the title of my dissertation, where it was read, incomparable things said incomparably well. That's a quote from Emerson. So when Whitman was not humble. One of my favorite Whitman things is a handwritten note where he says, "The Iliad and Shakespeare, leaves of grass." I mean, this is not a humble man, right? So, so what happened was he self-published Leaves of Grass. He sent, unasked, a copy to Emerson, and Emerson wrote him back this effusive, to Emerson's credit, this effusive letter saying, "I've never read anything comparable ever written in the United States," and so he was not a humble guy.
He probably did that.
And but it took him a while. But then, just to finish the thought, and I didn't talk about this because it wasn't the subject, but as we all know, Leaves of Grass is full of very, very radical for its time sexual imagery and claims about it. I mean, he hated religion because of what it did to the body, its suppression of the body. Okay, and Emerson tried to talk him into weakening that part.
And which
he,
bodies did he speak of more significantly?
But yeah, well, that's another question too. Anyway, so Emerson dropped him because he would not, minimize the sexual content of Leaves of Grass. It took about 10 years. It was really after the Civil War that Whitman suddenly became accepted. He was accepted in England before he was in the United States. But now he's everywhere. I mean, I think it was the last Dylan album had a song on it. The title of the song was "I Contain Multitudes." Any other questions? Okay, thank you.